Kospe said it's time to go, so we go. We are about to get into a really exciting conversation about rice. With ABV, we champion native grapes, hybrid grapes, regional fruit and grains. In the name of accessibility, in the name of solidarity economics, in the name of being responsible stewards of the narrative. Within that, we have Alice, who is based in Brooklyn, whose wines I really have the honor to be able to represent, with whom I've sat with in a couple of trainings, and each time they're really just mind-blowing, the perspective that you bring to this conversation. We have George, who champions sake and an incredible list with rule of thirds, who gave this really inspiring speech in the beginning of a sake tasting about a return to heirloom grains and rice and pre-industrial techniques within sake that just really blew my mind in a way that I can't go too deep into, because I do the rum thing, I do the wine thing, and to do sake, I would not be able to do anything else. And in comes Hana, who was based out in Portland and flew all the way out here to be with us, who made a really brilliant discourse in response to Yurika's article that was recently put out in Punch about how sake and rice ferments in general are not removed from these issues of colonization and imperialism just because they're not made of grapes. And that kind of gave rise to this panel on rice. So I'm so excited. I know I'm about to learn a whole lot. I hope you all can shake off whatever you think you know, or whatever has been programmed by way of brewing rice or anything otherwise, and we're really here to unify conversations and blur the lines. And again, it's all fermentation, it's all wine. So really excited about this. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Emily. It's such a pleasure of working with her a few years ago when I was in my wine career, and ever since then I've followed her work, and I'm beyond honored to be here today and to be talking with George and Alex. As she mentioned, the theme of today's panel, or this panel, is it's all inGRAINed. So we're going to be talking about grain-based ferments from Asia broadly, but also more specifically from Korea and Japan and the US. Having come from wine myself, and I know that this has mostly, with the conversation taking place today, have been about wines from fruits, from grapes, from blueberries, but also from sap, palm, honey. If we're opening our mind to beverages and the future of beverage, we really can't ignore all of the drinks that come from grains, which is a huge category, certainly not limited to rice. Chicha from corn, or chassin wine, or honestly, the number is endless. Beer. These are all really, really familiar, and sake and suru are just a newest part of the conversation. So I guess I want to start by asking you guys, why are we here today?
Thank you, Nina. Thank you, Jade, Justine, for being here. So, as Jade mentioned, we're all here today because of fermentation. And my role, or my mission really, is part of leading the sake program and the wine program at Rule of Thirds at our restaurant and at the shop, Big Sake, is to try to capture as much attention with the audience that has an open mind. And when we have guests coming to a Japanese restaurant and are kind of expecting and primed to be engaging with sake, some beverage that most of them have not grown up with and aren't familiar with, we're in a really great position and a platform to champion producers that we want people to get to know, and products and beverages that they want to know. And so, to me, it made sense in my mind to bring sake and rice fermented beverages into the natural wine conversation because, sorry, get closer. because there's so much to learn from these natural wine producers, native grape fermenters, and hybrid varietal farmers as well. That I think we're just primed in the space to be receptive to a lot of new information and tasting things without a whole lot of other context. So I'm here to learn.
And for me, and I think for, including all three of us here, the reason why we're here today is because we are at such an incredible moment in our modern history where globalization has brought us to a point where we can appreciate in depth and not just from a perspective of leaning on cultural tropes and understanding of heritage-based rice wine fermentation, and that is inclusive of all grains and not just limited to rice. I think for me personally, the way I ended up here has been such a natural, but it's a struggle. I'm a second generation Korean American. I learned how to brew from my dad when I was a child, and he had immigrated himself from Korea. My interest in the food category was born from trying to stay connected with my culture, and it was actually one of the few reasons why I was able to appreciate my Korean culture growing up, dealing with the identity crisis that is second generation anything. I think it's incredible that we're having a moment here at ABV here in 2023, here in Brooklyn, New York, and it really speaks to the potential of the soup category, but also grain-based ferments from all over the world. We're just at the beginning.
So I think most of us here have an understanding of how to define the wine category, such as it is, as it's evolving. But I'm not sure that everyone has that same knowledge and awareness around grain-based ferments or rice. So it would be great, George, if you could kind of define the rice and grain-based beverages that you work with, or starch for that matter, and also if you could define food more broadly.
So, well, I will say when I first started learning about sake in the beginning, there were a couple of my mentors that kind of drilled a point home to me that sake is not wine and that sake is not rice wine. So I think there's a lot of conversation to be had about that, but that was initially when I started out. I was very much trained to not think about sake as wine, and because I was told that wine was made from grapes and made from fruit, and grains don't have any fermentable juices, and they need to be converted in order to make alcohol. And so, generally speaking, I deal mainly with sake and shochu, traditional Japanese beverages here at Padilla Sake at Rule of Thirds. And what's really cool about sake brewing is that it involves two really important simultaneous fermentations. So I refer to talking about it as multiple parallel fermentation. And everyone's familiar with or sort of alcoholic fermentation where yeast eats sugar and turns it into alcohol and CO2. But in order for rice to turn into sake or turn into alcohol, you have to involve koji. And koji is a rice mold that is in the Aspergillus family, and it provides enzymes to do the saccharification. So koji is cultivated on rice or other grains, and it provides these enzymes, amylase and protease, that convert not only the complex starch and carbohydrates into fermentable sugars, but it also breaks down proteins into flavorful amino acids. And so sake is really cool and complex, and that it involves these kind of symbiotic fermentations that are managed by the brewer. It's great that we've got a brewer here that can speak a little bit more about that.
And the way we define kind of suru overall is actually by quite a broad definition at Hana Makgeolli. we define food as any grain-based ferment that is fermented with noodle, and that is, the subject to which George is referring to, which Nina is referring to. Noodle in the context of Korean brewing is typically a wheat and barley-based inoculant. It can be any number of cereals, but it is inoculated with wild saccharine fungus, wild yeast, and other bacteria, but predominantly wild lactic acid bacteria. All three general families of microbes are necessary for the successful conversion of starch to sugar and the successful conversion of sugar to alcohol. In the context of syrup brewing, though, and the kind of way it differs from a comparable category such as sake, is that instead of a monoculture ferment, so a single strain of aspergillus, which is koji, and then typically a single strain or proprietary yeast culture, we're dealing with a polyculture, right? On all fronts. And it's introduced from day one. So chemically speaking, both types of brews undergo a diastatic fermentation, which is, in other words, a parallel fermentation. It is and it isn't similar to beer. Right? In the beer making process, saccharification is achieved by malting first and then creating a wort out of your malted grain. In rice-based ferments, malting isn't necessarily the best way to achieve saccharification. You need to gelatinize a grain and then use an appropriate fungi that has enough saccharine power to break down that starch to sugar. So these are some of the distinctions that create variance between categories, not just their culture per se.
Okay, so with the definitions out of the way, we probably didn't have to define them in the wine conversations. I would love to dive a little bit into, and maybe starting with Alice, actually, dive a little bit into the history of sur and how it originated, what we know about it, and perhaps where it crosses over with other ferments that may also be common.
So if we go way back, like even prior to any kind of like documented evidence for rice or grain-based wines, their archaeologists have found that humanity overall has been making alcohol using rice since the beginning of time, right? In Korean, we refer to it as miinju. I don't know what the Japanese term is for it, but it is referring to a method in which you can break down starch by chewing it, relying on the enzymes in our own saliva to convert starch to sugar, and then allowing ambient yeast to convert that available sugars into alcohol in some form of a fermenter. Of course, all different styles of grain-based ferments originate from this origin. But when you start to look at more, it's not contemporary history, but like post-organized agriculture and organized civilization, you start to see differences that then create the cultures that are behind the different categories of alcohol, and it is typically defined by geographical country barriers, right? Overall, in Asia, most rice-based alcohol or just any alcohol fermentation techniques originate primarily from the conquests and the trade and the interactions that were brought along with the Mongolian invasion of the majority of the Asian peninsula. Fermentation techniques and distillation techniques were shared over the entire continent in a very effective way during the Mongolian Empire. There's also an incredible depth and volume of texts that show the interactions between what is now Korea, what is now Japan, what is now China. and the sharing of different styles of brewing practices, but typically involve some kind of serial inoculate of a fungi and some kind of way of capturing yeast ambiently, right? This is the basic premise and the basic origins of so many different alcohol production histories. But then when you start getting into the differences in a more modern sense, you also have to rely on historical knowledge, right? What does organized agriculture around rice, for example, look like in the last 100 years? And how did accessibility to different grains then influence the way a category is shaped and what kind of varieties and styles of wine there are? That's what really has brought us to this point today.
George, would you like to comment a little bit on also the parallel history of sake? And, you know, my understanding has been that these grain ferment pathways came through China, through Korea, and then into Japan by way of Kyushu, Southern Island, and then from there spread. There was also definitely, yes, like a mouth-chewing fermentation that took place before fungi facilitated fermentation. But I think also as we're kind of talking about and educating on the differences between these two, it would be important to maybe talk a little bit about the history of sake and the ways that it has evolved into modern times.
One thing I've been trying to do a little bit more homework on lately is just kind of how diverse the culinary history of Japan is, and I think from an outside perspective, it's easy to kind of flatten things a bit and make generalizations about a nation's cuisine as kind of like modern cuisine, but over time and over like geography, there is so much diversity in the way that these beverage traditions have evolved in Japan. Like Kyushu, where a lot of this technology and these practices kind of first originated in Japan, is now really known more for a region of distilled spirits of shochu, which also relies on koji fermentation to saccharify the grains. And then as the alcohol production moved northward in colder climates, that's where like Yanshu or Seishu or sake is taken root as far as the modern techniques that are practiced. So I'm particularly interested in how there's a lot of these traditional methods, and I kind of use shorthand and describe them as sourdough brewing techniques of Mizumoto, Bonemoto, these Yamahai, Kimoto. These are brewing techniques that rely on cultivating ambient lactic acid bacteria, which I think has a lot more in common with the syrup traditions as well. And these are techniques that were kind of lost due to convenience of technology in the turn of the 20th century when commercial lactic acid became available and industrialization processes became much more widespread and implemented in the sake industry. And it's really exciting to see in the past 2 decades or so a rediscovery or like a re-emphasis on some of these older techniques. So there's, history is coming out.
And is that true for food as well?
Traditional, like return to traditional methods. Yeah.
So to understand the makgeolli market and the way it is and what Hana Makgeolli's role within it, you have to kind of look back at history. The methods which George referred to in Japanese sake culture that relied on essentially like ambient microbiology to conduct the ferments has always been the original and true and traditional method of Korean alcohols. That being said, in the 1900s, within a 40 to 60 year span, really, we saw a near wiping out of what we refer to as cheongtongju methodologies. Cheongtongju in Korean means traditionally made Korean alcohols, and that has everything to do with war, famine, taxation, regulation, industrialization, the availability of technologies, and the pervasive kind of opinion that Saccharomyces is the universal brewers or winemaking yeast, or that Aspergillus is the universal most powerful saccharifying fungi, are only really recent or contemporary opinions. Stir brewing, at least in its truest form, when you're relying on Muduk and Muduk only, is typically not Saccharomyces dominant ferments. Actually, we're relying mostly on Pichia yeast, or Wickerhamomyces, which is viewed as a flawed culture, but in my opinion is just as efficient and powerful a yeast culture. In addition to that, instead of just relying on Aspergillus, most Luducs are actually more dominant in a culture called Rhizopus, which is another saccharifying fungi that is viewed as lesser. And we can kind of, boil, at this point in our history, we can view it as rustic, right? But when you talk about the viability of these cultures to create products that can then be sold in a market, I think that they are just as viable as, some of these, or the majority of the wines that are made with what we view as the universal brewing cultures. And yeah, for that reason, I forget what the original question was.
You totally answered it.
Yeah, I did, right?
You did.
Okay.
I think one thing that we all share and have actually kind of hedged our careers and our future on is that there's a lot of promise for sake in the US. And a big part of that conversation is products that are being made domestically. And so happy to see Makgeolli and sake being made in New York with Brooklyn Kura and with Kato Sake Works, and now very soon in upstate as well. And this is important because, of course, otherwise we were shipping glass and liquid, almost entirely around the world. So we need to develop our own local production. And I guess, as we were talking earlier, this presents a really exciting opportunity. So in your respective fields, can you talk about what that opportunity looks like?
So I remember the first time I tasted local Brooklyn sake about 5 years ago, and it was not like anything I had tasted before, and I didn't quite like it initially. It was just the feeling of it was kind of disorienting. It was an unpasteurized sake made with rice from California. It was probably the first time that I tasted sake with California Calvados rice, and I had unpasteurized sake before in Hamazake, but this is different because it was so fresh. It was probably brewed within 2 weeks or so when we tasted it, and importing sake or anything for that matter takes a bit of time, and so there is a built-in, even so slight maturation process. And for me, it was a little bit of a learning curve to repress what I had expected sake to taste like versus what was actually in my class, and just to kind of appreciate it for what was going on there. But and I do think it was served a little bit too waterful. It was like around this time of year, and we were tasting it in like a no air conditioned second floor studio space. So I wasn't under the best condition to appreciate it. But I kept on going back to it because I thought that there's something to be said about starting to crack open and opening up the black box of beverages that are unfamiliar and different and distinct from things that we're exposed to every day. And I kept up with the brewery to follow along. This was before they released their sake on the market, because I was really interested in having a place locally that was accessible to go visit and start to see the process and start to understand a bit more from the producer's perspective what actually goes into the craft of brewing these things. I'm not a producer. I very quickly got out of the kitchen, and I wanted to be more on the front of house side and presenting things that I really wanted to give a platform to. And so I really was grateful for the opportunity to get perspective and a glimpse into the world of brewing, just at least from a visitor perspective. And that's why I think it's very important to support these local producers, is it creates more accessible entry points for people to learn about and to experience and to really make sake or whichever beverage we're talking about part of their routine and lifestyle, and just like proximity does a lot to, over time, really help some of these new traditions in Brooklyn to take root.
Yeah. When you were saying that, sake and rice wine categories originating from Asia, these categories are almost always met with some level of expectation, definition. People think that, su, for example, and makgeolli in particular should look and taste a certain way. And for us, being able to produce it ourselves locally, relying on domestically grown rice, and being able to tell the truth of our production and then have our consumers and our guests hold us accountable to those elements in our brewing philosophy, that is, for me, the wonder in local production. I think when we were first starting, and still to this day, it's rare, but every once in a while we'll get someone that comes to us and says, how can you call yourself a traditional Korean rice wine brewery when you're not even based in Korea? And I'm like, well, if that's how you define traditional, then I have no argument. But if you give us a chance and try our wines and try to get a better understanding of what the intentions were when we were making it, then we might be able to understand. I think in this context, in the ABV context, when we're talking about rice wines, it's also important, and I'm sure we'll touch on it, talk about the agriculture and the industry surrounding rice. For us, the honor that we have to be able to work with Pollock Farms. They're a small family farm based in Maxwell, California, that grow rice. We use their product exclusively for all of our cuvées. I don't know, I feel so privileged to be able to know them and to use their rice and to show how it expresses itself in a brew. Of course, there's so much to the Korean brewing methodology that I have to share as a part of my job, but when it comes to local kind of production, that relationship in particular is a great source of pride.
So I'm curious, my understanding is that you use exclusively organic rice, is that correct? George, as you know, some sake are produced organically, but not all, and the conversation looks a little bit different than it does with wines. Is this something that you can comment on a little bit?
Sure. Yeah, no, organic rice and sake production in Japan is quite rare. There are a handful of breweries that have been taking a ton of work to just start to scratch the surface of implementing organic rice into the production. And there's a sake table from Zev Ravine Selections that has a bunch of really great producers that you can check out after the session if you'd like. But I had a chance to visit a couple sake breweries over the past spring, and it was one of the striking things about their discussion about organic rice is just really how low the yields are in Japan. Its climate is area that has such high humidity. There's a lot of disease pressure. There's a lot of pests that we have to contend with, and the brewery called Bino Honke in Fukushima, who's been focusing on organic rice actually for the past 60 years, which is quite a long time for in the context of the current state of sake rice farming in Japan. They've been working with their own contract farmers and some of their own rice paddies, and they're estimating like on a good year, they're getting somewhere around like 15% of yields compared to conventional farming. 15% is astounding. And they're a not large brewery, but sort of mid-sized brewery. They're producing a good amount of sake and exporting it all around Japan. And it's not only just the organic rice production, but they're really taking a holistic approach to as much self-sustaining practices as possible. So they're 100% solar powered and using their cedar groves to make slowly converting the fiberglass and their underlying tanks to traditional green wood vessels. So there's a lot of work that goes into it, and just imagine the amount of labor that goes into it. It's a very different way of approaching and structuring and organizing the labor in the business that you can see why it's challenging for businesses to make it work. But on the upside of it, I think there's a lot of opportunity for them to really create some longevity and how much their community is bought into sake brewing tradition in their town. They've been making sake for 300 years and they want to keep doing it for another 300 years and are intentionally making these hard decisions to invest in core labor to really get the buy-in to these practices. And yeah, no, it's really eye-opening to start to dig into the farming side of sake production in Japan because it has not been so transparent, and a lot of the rice has been distributed through co-ops and going from different sources and things. But it's great to see there's a couple of breweries that are really doing primary sourcing with contract farmers and directly farming themselves.
One of the things we were talking about as we were preparing before this is that there are also a lot of opportunities culturally in terms of the market, in terms of how these drinks are consumed, their context, the food that they're paired with, and avoiding placing these drinks in very specific boxes, which might be having sake with Japanese food, having makgeolli with Korean food, and where would you like to see the future of the enjoyment of these beverages?
So with Hana, I think we've been around for just under 3 years. We're quite new in terms of our lifetime as a producer. And prior to that, Hana was like this bootleg homebrewing project. Since those more bootleg days, our case for makgeolli in terms of its versatility and its application, when it comes to food pairings, when it comes to its cocktailability, when it comes to the occasion and the place and the weather in which you can drink it, we've always kind of argued that it can be drunk anywhere by anyone with anything, and that is actually culturally the only rule in Korean drinking culture is to drink it with food, doesn't matter which type, and to drink it with people. Better off to be your loved ones. For our future at Hana, I think our hope is that we're able to convince more and more people that this truth is real. And we have been really grateful to see, so many of our restaurant partners and our bar partners and even just individual consumers play with our products. You know, the yakju that we're drinking right now, of course, does wonderfully with Korean food, but it rocks with crudo programs of all sorts. And it cocktails well and can even be viewed as a vermouth in some kind of applications. So when it comes to craft su, when it comes to wild fermented su, the potential is truly endless. And as small as it is right now, I am hoping that we're making a impressionable or long-lasting kind of change in the way consumers view these kinds of products.
Sure, I think so. One of my favorite ways of trying to open up the sake conversation with folks is to frame it in a way that it's not a choice of sake versus wine, or sake versus another beverage, or syrup versus another beverage, but there's room on the table for all of these things to kind of coexist at the same time. And maybe heard of what's most common or mainstream with wine service and the way that we drink wine out of wine glasses and cups and all these other things. There's actually so much more diversity in servingware and vessels when it comes to sake service or syrup service. And the restaurant, we love serving sake in tokuri and these carafes and chocolate ceramic cups, because if you've got that on the table, there's totally room for a bottle of wine and a glass of wine at the same time. And, I enjoy and I appreciate variety on the table at beverages and having as much as possible. Sometimes more is more, and that there's a lot of room to open up the conversation for people to find their own experience when it's not when you're not dictating that certain beverages go with certain cuisine, or even just flavor palette, like certain flavor profiles going with certain foods. And I think it's important to give space for people to create their own experiences at home and learn to live with these things.
Yeah, I definitely think that the lack of rules when it comes to serveware, when it comes to service and pairing, as we move, grain-based alcohols from their original context into the American context, there's no rules for us. We don't need to observe any rules. We can do whatever we want. And I could definitely confirm that in my household, there's a bottle of wine right next to a bottle of sake, and there's a glass right next to a sake cup at most dinners with guests. But we only have a couple minutes left, so I definitely want to open this up to any questions.
Hi. In your approach viewing the enthusiasm about grain-based beverages, not from the lens of New York, but from more of a national or international lens, what do you feel is the response so far, and what do you think that the unset boundaries? What do you think the possibilities are? Like, there's a boundaries of what the possibilities, especially when we're looking at it from not just a New York lens, but from a national or international lens.
So I think when we're thinking about global markets, the kind of benchmarks and market sizes that you see in the US are generally still what you see globally. Grape wine as an industry overall, that is inclusive of conventional and natural wines, is a multi-billion-dollar industry. And beer is the same as well. I don't think that will ever change, but to George's testament earlier, there is room for more when it comes to grain-based ferments. And the growth of categories such as sake and the growth of categories such as food in a global context doesn't mean that it has to fight the wine markets per se. When we think about Korean culture, it is synonymous with soju. Those little green bottles that taste like water and sneak up on you. It is by volume, one of the highest selling categories of alcohol across the world. And that really is just the beginning. My hope, though, is that as things progress and as our maturity level as consumers increase and our understanding of these categories and how these products are made matures, that the consumer can discern for themselves, well, what is well made, what am I willing to put in my body, that can mean, and that isn't restrictive to any kind of food pairing or cuisine. It's more about, well, what was the intentions of the producer, what was the intentions behind whatever grain that was being fermented, and overall the general appreciation for the quality and the craft of the product will grow along with its market presence around the world.
Yeah, I think there is a lot of potential for grain-based beverages to really take root and proliferate a bit more. And there's sake breweries opening up in many other countries, and I think all it really takes is a couple of passionate individuals to really champion something that they love and that they care about, and to cultivate their own audience. And I mean, that goes with any of these beverages that are here today. It's like somebody has to be a champion for that, whether you're a producer or just a drinker of the kind. And yeah, I think you have to be vocal and just have to get into somebody's glass and in front of them. Repeated exposure is the way forward.
Well, thank you so much to Jade, to ABV for having this conversation with us. Thank you guys both for being here and also for including rice in the conversation as well. We are thrilled to be part of the class.